Before Evelyn Harper could step off the platform, a man's hand closed around her wrist. "Don't climb onto that wagon," Thomas Reed said. "Until you tell me the truth, did you come here to marry me or to disappear?" Evelyn froze. Behind her, the train whistle screamed north, her only way home. Ahead of her stood a stranger who already knew she was running from something. And in that instant, on a dust-covered platform in Red Willow, Colorado, a mail-order bride realized her new husband might see through her more than any man ever had. For a moment, Evelyn could not speak. The words simply would not come. She stood there, one gloved hand still gripping the handle of her trunk, the other caught in the rough, sun-worn grip of a man she had never met in person. A man twice as tall as she remembered from his photograph. A man whose eyes did not look away from hers even for a second. "Let go of me," she finally said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Thomas released her wrist immediately. "I apologize," he said. "That was not how I meant to greet you." "Then how did you mean to greet me?" He hesitated. For a man who had just asked her the most invasive question of her life, he suddenly seemed unsure of himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've thought about this moment for 3 weeks. I never figured out the right words. So you chose the wrong ones instead." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. Something closer to respect. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I did." Evelyn looked past him toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Red Willow, a mercantile, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, a sheriff's office with its door hanging open in the wind. This was it. This was the town she had crossed half a country to reach. And already within 30 seconds of meeting her husband, she wanted to turn around and get back on the train. "You didn't answer me," Thomas said quietly. "I don't owe you an answer to a question like that. Not yet. Not before you've even said hello properly." "You're right." He removed his hat. Dust fell from the brim. "Hello, Miss Harper. I'm Thomas Reed. Thank you for coming all this way." Evelyn studied him. Weathered face, calloused hands, a voice that carried the low, careful rhythm of a man used to speaking to skittish animals and even more skittish people. "That's better," she said. "Though I notice you didn't take back the question." "No," Thomas said. "I didn't." "Why not?" "Because I still want to know the answer." Evelyn felt her spine straighten. "Then I'll tell you something instead, Mr. Reed. I came 1,000 miles on a train that smelled of coal smoke and unwashed men past 3 states I'd never seen to marry someone I only know through 11 letters. If you think I'm going to explain myself to you on a train platform before I've even eaten a proper meal, you are going to be disappointed in this marriage very quickly." For the first time, something shifted in Thomas Reed's face. It might have been the beginning of a smile. It was gone before she could be sure. "Fair enough," he said. "Let me take your trunk." The wagon ride out of town was quiet at first. Too quiet. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the buildings of Red Willow shrink behind them, replaced by open land that seemed to stretch on without any interruption at all. No fences, no roads, no sign that another human being existed within 100 miles. She had read about the West. She had not understood it until now. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. 2 hours, Thomas said. "Maybe less if the road's dry. And in those 2 hours, do you intend to speak to me? Or was the interrogation at the station the entirety of our conversation for today?" Thomas actually laughed at that, a short, surprised sound like he hadn't expected to. "You're sharper than your letters," he said. "You're ruder than yours." "I wasn't trying to be rude." "Then what were you trying to be exactly?" "Because a man doesn't ask a woman if she came to disappear unless he already suspects the answer." Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "I've had bad luck with people who weren't honest about why they came here," he said finally. "I didn't want to make the same mistake twice." "Twice?" Evelyn repeated. He didn't elaborate. "That's not an answer, Mr. Reed." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They rode in silence for another mile. Evelyn watched the land change, grass giving way to scrub, giving way to distant hills the color of dried clay. She thought of Missouri, of green fields and orderly fences, and a life that had made sense until it suddenly didn't. "I did come here because I had nowhere else to go," she said quietly. Thomas glanced at her. "But that isn't the whole truth," she continued. "I also came because I wanted a life that belonged to me, not one that was given to me out of pity or taken from me out of debt. I have spent the last 3 months being told what I have lost. I would like for once to be told what I might still gain." The wagon creaked beneath them. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out and dropped toward the grass. "That's a better answer than I expected," Thomas said. "It's the only honest one I have." "Then it's enough." 3 months earlier, Evelyn Harper had been standing in the doorway of her father's bookstore in Independence, Missouri, watching a man in a gray coat nail a notice to the front window. Foreclosure. The word had not felt real, not even when the man turned and looked at her with something close to apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry, miss," he'd said. "Your father's debts." "My father is dead," Evelyn had said. "He can't answer for debts anymore. I can." "That's precisely the problem, miss. You can't, not legally, not without a husband or a male guarantor." She had wanted to scream at him. She had wanted to tell him that she had kept the store's ledgers since she was 16 years old, that she understood the business better than her father ever had in his final years, that the debts were not the result of her incompetence, but of a man's slow decline into grief after her mother's death. Instead, she had simply nodded, because screaming changed nothing. And in 1882, a woman's competence meant very little against the law's insistence that she required a man's name beside her own to be trusted with anything at all. That night, Evelyn had sat at her father's desk, staring at the stack of unpaid notices, and made a decision that terrified her. She was not going to marry out of desperation. She was going to marry on her own terms if she was going to marry at all. She found Thomas Reed's advertisement 3 days later, tucked into the back pages of a matrimonial paper her aunt had left behind. "Wanted a wife and partner for a working ranch in Colorado. I cannot offer wealth or ease. I can offer honesty, respect, and a life built together, not given. Write only if you are willing to work." Every other advertisement in that paper promised comfort, promised protection, promised a woman she would be cherished and cared for, as though she were something fragile to be placed on a shelf. Thomas Reed's advertisement promised none of that. It was the only one that sounded like it was written by a man who respected the woman reading it enough to tell her the truth. Evelyn wrote back that same night. Their correspondence had not been what she expected. She had imagined foolishly, she realized later, that a rancher writing for a wife would ask about her appearance, her age, her willingness to bear children quickly. Thomas asked none of that. His first letter had read, "What do you do when things go wrong?" Not what you hope you would do. What you have actually done the last time your life fell apart. Evelyn had stared at that question for 2 days before answering. "I keep working," she had finally written. "I do not have the luxury of falling apart. Someone always needs the accounts balanced, or the shelves restocked, or the front door unlocked regardless of what has been lost. I have learned that grief waits for no one, and neither can I." His reply had come faster than she expected. "That is either the strongest answer I have ever received, or the saddest. Possibly both. I am sorry for what you have lost. I will not ask you to explain it unless you wish to." She had not wished to, not yet. But something about a stranger acknowledging her pain without demanding details of it had undone something tightly wound in her chest. Their letters continued for 6 weeks. He asked what frightened her. "Becoming invisible," she wrote. "Being someone's obligation instead of someone's equal." He asked what she wanted beyond survival. "To matter," she wrote. "Not because of what I can provide, but because of who I am." And once in a letter she almost didn't send, she asked him the same question back. "What are you afraid of, Mr. Reed?" His answer had taken nearly 3 weeks to arrive. When it finally came, it was shorter than any letter before it. "That I already failed at this once. that I will not know how to do it right a second time. That the woman who agrees to come here deserves better than a man who does not know how to say what he feels until it is too late to matter. Evelyn had read that letter 7 times. She had not understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now, sitting beside him in a wagon, watching him avoid her eyes every time the conversation edged too close to his past. "You said twice," Evelyn said, breaking the silence as the wagon crested a low hill. "Earlier, you said you didn't want to make the same mistake twice." Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "I did say that. Are you going to tell me what you meant, or am I meant to guess for the rest of my life? It's not a simple story. I have 2 hours apparently and nowhere else to be." Thomas exhaled slowly. "I was married before," he said. Evelyn had suspected as much, something in the way he carried himself. Careful, guarded like a man walking across ice he didn't trust, had told her there was history beneath the silence. What happened to her? She left. Why? Because I thought providing for someone was the same as loving them. I built her a house. I gave her everything I could pull out of this land with my own 2 hands, and I never once asked her if she was happy because I assumed a full pantry and a solid roof answered that question on its own. His voice had gone flat, not cold flat like a man reciting something he had turned over in his mind so many times it had lost its sharp edges. She told me the night she left that she had felt more alone in our marriage than she had ever felt as a single woman. I did not understand that sentence for a long time. Do you understand it now? I'm trying to. Evelyn watched him. Is that why you asked me that question at the station, whether I came here to disappear? Thomas nodded once. I didn't want to marry someone who was running from her life only to vanish into mine. I've watched that happen before. A woman arrives desperate, grateful for any escape, and slowly she disappears into the work, into the silence, into being needed instead of being known. I didn't want that for you. I suppose I asked the question badly, but I meant it honestly. For the first time since stepping off the train, Evelyn felt something other than defensiveness toward this man, something closer to understanding. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 months, she said quietly. Good, Thomas said. I'd like it to be the first of many. The wagon slowed as they approached a narrow crossing where the road dipped toward a shallow creek. A rider was waiting there. Evelyn noticed him before Thomas did, a man on a dark horse positioned squarely in the middle of the road, as though he had been waiting for them. Thomas's entire posture changed. His shoulders squared. His jaw set. Stay behind me, he said quietly, and there was an edge in his voice Evelyn hadn't heard before. Who is that? Silas Cobb. He works for Garrett Hollis. The name meant nothing to Evelyn, but the way Thomas said it, like a curse held carefully between his teeth, told her it should have. Afternoon, Reed, the rider called out as they drew closer. His eyes moved past Thomas, settling on Evelyn with an expression she didn't like. This must be the new wife. Mr. Hollis will be real interested to hear you finally got yourself another one. State your business, Silas, or move off the road. No business today, just a message. Silas's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Hollis says the survey's coming next week. Says it'd be a shame if the paperwork on your land turned out to be as shaky as everyone thinks it is. My paperwork is not shaky. That's not what the county clerk's been saying. Silas's gaze flicked to Evelyn again. Of course, maybe a new wife changes things. Maybe it don't. We'll see come the survey. He turned his horse without waiting for a response and rode off toward the hills, dust rising in his wake. Evelyn sat very still. What was that about? She asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward faster than before. Thomas, it's nothing you need to worry about today. You just told a stranger you didn't want a wife who disappeared into silence, and now you're doing exactly what you accused your first wife of feeling alone beside. That landed. She saw it land, saw something crack briefly across his composed expression. There's a man named Garrett Hollis, Thomas said finally, who has spent 2 years trying to prove my land doesn't legally belong to me. He wants it. He's wanted it since before my father died and left it to me. And he's very good at making people believe things that aren't true. Is your claim to the land real? Yes. Then why does he think he can take it? Thomas's hands were tight on the reins. Because proving a claim in this territory sometimes matters less than who the judge believes, and Garrett Hollis has spent a great deal of money making sure judges believe him. Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. Is that why you needed a wife? She asked slowly. Not companionship, not partnership. Something to do with the land. No, Thomas said too quickly. Thomas. It's more complicated than that. Then uncomplicate it, now. Before we reach that ranch, because I did not travel 1,000 miles to discover I am a signature on someone's legal document instead of a wife. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop. For a long moment he said nothing at all, staring out at the empty land ahead of them, like it might offer him the right words. There is a clause in my father's will, he said finally. The land passes fully and unquestionably to a married Reed. Hollis has spent 2 years arguing that because I was unmarried when he died, the inheritance is contestable. A wife closes that argument permanently. I won't lie to you and say that wasn't part of why I placed that advertisement. Evelyn felt something inside her go very still. But it wasn't the only reason. Thomas continued quieter now. I could have found a dozen women willing to marry a rancher with land to protect. I wrote to you specifically because of what you said in your letters. Because you understood what it meant to lose everything and still refuse to disappear. That doesn't change the fact that you married me partly to win a legal fight. No, he admitted. It doesn't. Evelyn stared at the empty road ahead, at the hills beyond it, at the life she had just committed herself to, without fully understanding its terms. What else haven't you told me, Mr. Reed? Thomas met her eyes. More than I should have waited this long to say, he said. But I'd rather tell you the rest at the house where I can show you the papers than out here on the road where anyone could be listening. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She thought of the foreclosure notice on her father's bookstore window. She thought of a man in a gray coat telling her that her competence meant nothing without a man's name attached to it. And she thought with a bitterness that surprised her that she had crossed 1,000 miles, only to discover that her signature was valuable to yet another man for reasons that had nothing to do with who she actually was. Drive on, she said finally. But I want every paper you have. Tonight. You'll have them. The ranch house appeared first as a shape on the horizon, low sturdy built of timber gone silver, with weather smoke rising thin and steady from a stone chimney. A hired hand came out to meet the wagon, an older man with a limp and a wary expression that shifted to open curiosity the moment he saw Evelyn. This the new Mrs. Reed? He asked. Evelyn, Thomas said. This is Amos. He's worked this land longer than I've been alive. Pleasure, ma'am. Amos tipped his hat, then glanced at Thomas with a look that carried a question neither man spoke aloud. Everything all right on the road? Silas Cobb stopped us. Amos's face darkened. Hollis send him. Surveys next week. That ain't good. No. Thomas agreed. It isn't. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon before either man could offer assistance, brushing dust from her skirts, taking in the house that was now apparently hers, as much as it was his. It was smaller than she expected, plainer, but solid, built by someone who understood that survival mattered more than appearance. I'll show you inside, Thomas said. The interior was simple, a large main room with a stone hearth, a kitchen area along one wall, a narrow hallway leading toward what she assumed were bedrooms, and one door at the very end of the hallway that was closed. Not simply shut. Latched with a small iron hook that suggested it was rarely if ever opened. What's in there? Evelyn asked. Thomas's expression shuddered instantly. Nothing that concerns tonight, he said. Let me show you the papers first. You wanted honesty. I intend to give you all of it. He led her to a small desk in the corner of the main room, opened a drawer, and withdrew a thick folder of documents. As he did, something slid loose and fell to the floor. Evelyn bent to retrieve it before he could stop her. A ring, a woman's wedding ring, plain gold, slightly tarnished, resting in her palm, like it weighed far more than its size suggested. "Thomas. That was my first wife's," he said quietly. "I should have put it away properly. I'm sorry." Evelyn held the ring for a long moment before setting it carefully on the desk. "You told me she left," Evelyn said slowly. "Left or something else?" Thomas's silence stretched long enough that Evelyn's stomach turned cold. "She died," he said finally. 18 months after she left. Fever in Denver alone. I found out 3 weeks after it happened." The words hung in the room like smoke that wouldn't clear. "I didn't tell you at the station," Thomas continued, "because I didn't know how to say it without sounding like I was asking for pity." "I don't want your pity, Evelyn. I want you to understand why I asked you that question about disappearing. Because I watched it happen once already. I watched someone I failed to see clearly enough disappear right out of my life, and I didn't even know she was gone until it was too late to fix anything." Evelyn looked at the ring on the desk, then at the closed door at the end of the hallway, then at the folder of legal papers still clutched in Thomas Reed's hand, papers that would determine whether the roof over their heads still belonged to them by the time the county surveyor finished his work next week. "There's a great deal you haven't told me," she said quietly. "The land, Garrett Hollis, your wife, that door at the end of the hall. I know. I need you to tell me all of it. Not tonight, perhaps, but soon, because I did not come here to be protected from the truth, Mr. Reed. I came here because your advertisement promised me a partner, and partners do not keep locked doors from each other." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, really looked the way he had at the train station, like he was trying to see past every carefully composed thing she had ever told anyone. "All right," he said finally. "Tomorrow. I'll tell you everything tomorrow, starting with what's behind that door and what Garrett Hollis actually wants from this land, because it isn't only the acres he's after. It never was." Evelyn felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air seeping through the timber walls. What does he want, if not the land? Thomas's eyes moved just briefly to the folder of papers in his hands, papers with names on them. Evelyn had not yet been permitted to read. "Something buried in my father's will," he said quietly, "that I have spent 3 years trying to make certain no one else discovers before I do." Thomas set the folder of papers on the desk beside the ring, but he did not open it. Instead, he walked to the end of the hallway and lifted the small iron hook from its latch. "You should see this before you see the papers," he said. "It'll make more sense in order." Evelyn followed him, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She had imagined for one terrible second a nursery, a dead child, some grief too large for him to speak aloud at a train station. The door swung open. It was not a nursery. It was a study, small, cramped, lined floor to ceiling, with shelves of ledgers, deeds, and yellowed correspondence. A roll-top desk buried under stacks of paper, tied with string. A single narrow window letting in the last gray light of evening. "This was my father's room," Thomas said. "He built this ranch out of nothing, and everything he ever did to hold on to it is in here. I locked it because I couldn't bear to sort through it after he died, and because some of what's in here Garrett Hollis would very much like to see burned." Evelyn stepped inside, slowly running her fingers along the spine of a ledger dated 18 years back. "You said something is buried in your father's will," she said. "Is it in this room?" "Part of it." "Only part?" Thomas closed the door behind them, and something in the click of the latch made Evelyn's pulse quicken. "My father bought this land in 1861 from a man named Everett Hollis," he said. "Garrett's father. 640 acres paid in full deed recorded at the county office in Larkspur." "That sounds straightforward." "It was for 20 years. Thomas pulled a thick ledger from the shelf and set it on the desk. "Then gold was found 11 miles north of here, and suddenly this land wasn't just grazing ground anymore. It was worth 10 times what my father paid for it. And Everett Hollis started telling anyone who'd listen that the sale had never been a sale at all. What did he claim it was? A lease. 99 years expiring in 1960. He said my father misunderstood the terms or lied about them depending on which day you asked him. Evelyn's stomach turned cold. And the original deed? Recorded, filed, should be irrefutable. Thomas's jaw tightened. Except 3 years ago, the courthouse in Larkspur burned. Half the county's land records went up with it. And when the new copies were filed from the surviving duplicates, the entry for this parcel was different, Evelyn finished. Was gone, Thomas said. Not different, gone, as though it had never existed. The room felt suddenly smaller. Someone destroyed it, Evelyn said. On purpose. I can't prove that. But I know Garrett Hollis's man Silas Cobb was seen in Larkspur 2 days before that fire, and I know Garrett Hollis inherited his father's claim and his father's grudge the same year the courthouse burned to the ground. I've never believed that was a coincidence, and I never will. Evelyn sat down slowly in the chair beside the desk. So you have no proof the deed ever existed. I have this. Thomas reached past her and pulled a smaller, older ledger from the back of the shelf, leather-bound, cracked at the spine. My father's personal record book. Every transaction he ever made is written here in his own hand, including the purchase from Everett Hollis, witnessed and dated. It isn't a legal document. It wouldn't hold up in a courtroom on its own. Then what good is it? It tells us who else witnessed the sale. A notary named Josiah Pratt still living. Last my father heard somewhere near Cheyenne. If he's alive, and if he remembers his testimony, could restore what the fire destroyed. Evelyn stared at the faded ink at a signature that had survived 2 decades and a courthouse fire only because one grieving son had locked it away out of guilt. Why haven't you gone to find this man already? Thomas was quiet for a moment too long. Because the last time I went looking for someone who could help me prove this land was mine, he said. I lost someone I loved doing it. Evelyn looked up sharply. Margaret, she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded once, and something in his face closed like a door being shut against weather. She found this room before I ever meant to show her, he said. Same as you in a way. She started reading through my father's papers on her own, trying to help. She found a letter, one I hadn't even seen, from a lawyer in Denver who'd been quietly buying up testimony against my father's claim, paying witnesses to say things that weren't true. What did she do? She wrote to the lawyer herself, under her own name, asked him directly what he was being paid and by whom, thinking she could shame an honest answer out of him. Thomas's voice had gone low and rough. 2 weeks later, a man rode onto this property at night and shot out every window on the east side of the house. Left a note nailed to the porch. It said a woman who asks too many questions might not like the answers she finds. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas. I told her it was nothing. I told her Hollis was all threat and no follow-through because that's what I needed to believe. Because if I admitted how dangerous it actually was, I'd have had to admit I couldn't protect her from it. He set the ledger down carefully, like it might break. She left 3 weeks later. I told everyone in town it was because ranch life didn't suit her. It was easier than telling the truth that my wife ran from this house in the middle of the night because I refused to see how frightened she was. You said she died of fever. She did. 18 months after she left in a boarding house in Denver alone with no one to send word to me until it was already over. His hands had curled into fists on the desktop. I have spent 3 years telling myself that if I had simply listened to her fear instead of dismissing it, she would still be here. The room was silent, except for the wind pressing against the small window. Evelyn didn't reach for him. She understood somehow that comfort offered too quickly would feel like pity, and pity was the one thing this man had explicitly told her he couldn't stand. Is that why you asked me at the station if I came here to disappear? She said instead. Yes. You weren't asking about me at all, were you? You were asking whether I'd vanish the way she did quietly out of fear without ever telling you why. Thomas looked at her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, his composure cracked entirely. I don't know how to do this a second time, he admitted. I don't know how to have a wife in this house with this danger still circling it without becoming the kind of husband who gets her killed through his own stubbornness. Then don't be that husband, Evelyn said simply. Tell me the truth, all of it, every time. That's the only thing that will keep me safe, Thomas. Not silence, not protection. The truth. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. Then here's the rest of it. Garrett Hollis doesn't just want the land back. He wants it before the railroad survey reaches this county, because once that survey's filed, the boundaries become permanent, unchallengeable, recorded under federal protection instead of county record. That survey is happening in 9 days. If Hollis can get a judge to rule in his favor before then, he takes 640 acres of the most valuable grazing and mineral land in this territory permanently, and there will be nothing left for me to appeal. And the marriage clause in your father's will protects my claim provided the marriage is proven legitimate, which is exactly why Silas Cobb made a point of mentioning you today. Hollis's lawyers will argue this marriage was arranged purely to manufacture a legal defense. If they can prove that in front of a judge, the clause doesn't help me at all. Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something harder than fear. Then we don't give them anything to prove, she said. We find this notary, we restore the deed, and we make certain that whatever they say about why I came here, no one can argue about what kind of wife I intend to be. Thomas looked at her like he was seeing something for the first time. You don't have to fight this battle, he said quietly. You married a stranger, Evelyn, not a war. I'd understand if you wanted no part of what comes next. You put an advertisement in a newspaper asking for a partner, Mr. Reed, not an ornament, not a witness to your suffering. She stood smoothing her skirts, her voice steadier than she felt. If Garrett Hollis wants to take this land from you, he is going to have to go through both of us. Something shifted in Thomas's face. It might have been relief. It might have been the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. They didn't sleep much that night. Evelyn sat at the small kitchen table, with the ledger open in front of her, copying names and dates onto a fresh sheet of paper while Thomas built up the fire against the growing chill. Josiah Pratt, she said, tapping the page. Notary Public, Larkspur County, 1861. If he witnessed the original sale, he'd have kept his own copy of the notarization, wouldn't he? Notaries usually do. If he's still alive, if he still has it, if he's willing to travel this far to testify against a man with Hollis's money and reach. Thomas rubbed a hand across his jaw. That's 3 very large ifs. Better 3 large ifs than none at all. Evelyn glanced up. Do you have an address for him? An old one. My father corresponded with him years back before the fire even happened. I don't know if it's still good. Then we write to him tomorrow first thing, and we pray the postal service is faster than Garrett Hollis's patience. Thomas watched her from across the room, something unreadable in his expression. You're remarkably calm for a woman who learned all in the same afternoon that her marriage might be legally contested, and that her husband's first wife may have died partly because of the very fight you've just agreed to join. Evelyn set down her pen. I have spent 3 months being calm about things that terrified me, Mr. Reed. My father's death, my home taken out from under me, a future I didn't choose being decided by men who never once asked what I wanted. She met his eyes. I would rather be calm and useful than frightened and idle. Calm I can control. Frightened does nothing but waste the hours I have to fix this. Something in Thomas's throat moved. Margaret was frightened, he said quietly. I never blamed her for it. I only wish... You wish she'd let you fight beside her instead of alone. Yes. Evelyn held his gaze. I don't intend to make that mistake, she said. Whatever comes. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, wind moved through the grass with a low, steady sound, like the land itself was breathing. There's something else you should know, Thomas said after a long silence. About the note nailed to the porch the night they shot out the windows. What? I never told the sheriff who I suspected sent it. I never told anyone but Amos. His voice had gone careful, deliberate. If Hollis's men come around again now that there's a new wife in this house, I need you to understand going to the law in this county won't necessarily help us. The sheriff's cousin is married to Hollis's business partner. I'm not saying the man's crooked. I'm saying I've never trusted him enough to test it." Evelyn absorbed that slowly. "Then who can we trust?" "Amos, myself. And as of today, you." Thomas's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "It's a short list." "Short lists are easier to keep loyal," Evelyn said. For the first time all evening, Thomas laughed a real laugh, low and surprised, out of him, like it had been dragged loose from somewhere he'd forgotten existed. "You know," he said, "when I imagined the woman who'd answer that advertisement, I pictured someone quiet. Someone who'd need convincing to stay through a hard winter, let alone a legal war with a man like Hollis." "Are you disappointed?" "No," Thomas said, and something in the way he said it made Evelyn's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I am the opposite of disappointed." The letter to Josiah Pratt went out with the mail rider 3 days later, along with a second letter. Thomas insisted on sending this one to a lawyer in Denver named Charles Ambrose, an old acquaintance of his father's, a man Thomas trusted enough to ask for guidance on how to force a corrupted courthouse record back into question. The waiting nearly undid Evelyn. She filled the days with ranch work she'd never done before, learning to read the ledgers Thomas had neglected for years, discovering within the first week that nearly $400 had gone unaccounted for in cattle sales dating back to the previous autumn. "Someone's been skimming your profits," she told Thomas over supper on the fourth night, sliding the ledger across the table. "Either your buyer in Larkspur is cheating you on the count, or someone closer to home is." Thomas frowned at his numbers. "Amos handles the sales when I can't make the trip myself." "I'm not accusing Amos." "I know you're not. I'm thinking out loud." He studied the figures a moment longer. "This buyer, Whitfield, out of Larkspur, he's the same man who processes the county's land filings. Same office that lost the record of my deed in the fire." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "You think he's working for Hollis?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that a man who can quietly lose a deed can just as easily quietly shortchange a cattle count, and nobody notices either one until someone sits down and actually adds the numbers herself." He looked at her with something that was unmistakably admiration. "Nobody's caught that discrepancy in over a year," he said. "Nobody's looked," Evelyn said. "That's the trouble with men who assume the numbers will take care of themselves." Jed. Amos confirmed it 2 days later, returning from Larkspur with a face like a thundercloud. "Whitfield's been undercounting our herd by 6, maybe 8 head every sale for the better part of a year," he said, dropping his hat onto the table with more force than necessary. "I always figured it was an honest mistake. Man's getting older, I thought. Never once thought to check the numbers against yours." "Because you had no reason to distrust him," Evelyn said. "Until now. He's been paid off," Thomas said flatly. "By Hollis, skimming just enough to make it look like bad luck instead of theft while feeding Hollis information about how thin our finances are running before the survey." "That's a serious accusation," Amos said. "It's the only one that makes sense." Thomas's hands had curled into fists again. Evelyn was starting to recognize the gesture, the way he braced for a fight he couldn't yet see coming. "Whitfield handles our land filings and our cattle sales. If he's compromised on one, he's compromised on both." "Which means," Evelyn said slowly, "he may know something about what really happened to the original deed." The room went very quiet. "If he does," Thomas said, "he's not going to tell us willingly." "Then we don't ask him willingly," Evelyn said. "We ask him with proof of the cattle theft already in hand, and we let him understand that confessing to the smaller crime might be the only thing that keeps him out of a cell for the larger one." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this." "I had 4 days of waiting for a letter to arrive from Cheyenne, and nothing better to do with my hands," Evelyn said. "I read every ledger in that study twice." Amos let out a low whistle. "Mr. Reed, I believe you married a woman smarter than the both of us combined." "I'm aware," Thomas said, and this time when he looked at Evelyn, There was no hesitation in the warmth of it at all. Kyle. The letter from Cheyenne arrived 9 days later on the same morning. Silas Cobb rode past the property line twice, slow, deliberate, close enough to be seen, and far enough to claim, if questioned, that he'd simply been passing through. Thomas tore the envelope open at the kitchen table. Evelyn standing at his shoulder, both of them holding their breath. Mr. Reed, I remember your father well, and I remember witnessing the sale of the Hollis parcel in the summer of 1861. I kept my notary records for every transaction I ever witnessed, as was my custom, and I still possess them. I am willing to testify in person, if necessary, to what I witnessed that day, provided my travel and safety can be assured. I have heard even this far from Colorado that Garrett Hollis is not a man who tolerates inconvenient truths quietly. I would ask that you take precautions before my arrival is made known to anyone in Larkspur. Josiah Pratt. Evelyn read it twice. He'll testify, she said. Thomas, he'll actually testify. If he makes it here alive, Thomas said quietly, and the joy in the room dimmed just slightly under the weight of that single condition. Then we make certain he does, Evelyn said. We meet him somewhere Hollis wouldn't think to look. We keep his travel quiet. And we get Charles Ambrose out here from Denver before the survey, so there's a lawyer standing beside us the moment Pratt's testimony is filed. Thomas folded the letter carefully, like it was something precious enough to break. 9 days, he said. The survey's in 9 days. We have to bring Pratt in, file the testimony, and have Ambrose ready to argue it in front of a judge, all before Hollis can maneuver around it. Then we'd better move faster than he expects, Evelyn said. Men like Garrett Hollis always assume the people they're stealing from are too tired or too frightened or too alone to fight back quickly. We're going to prove him wrong on all 3 counts. Thomas reached out almost without thinking and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her since the train platform. 3 months ago, he said quietly, I wrote to a stranger and asked her what she did when things fell apart. I don't think I understood until right now what kind of answer I was actually going to get. Evelyn didn't pull her hand away. I told you, she said. I keep working. I remember. Then let's get to work, Mr. Reed. We have a dishonest county clerk to confront a notary to protect, and 9 days to save your father's land from a man who spent 2 decades trying to steal it out from under a family that never did him a moment's wrong. They rode into Larkspur 2 days later, Thomas, Evelyn, and Amos together, the ledger with its damning cattle count tucked carefully into Thomas's coat. Whitfield's office sat at the end of the main street, respectable-looking brass nameplate, polished curtains drawn halfway against the afternoon sun. He looked up when the bell above the door rang, and Evelyn watched something flicker across his face the instant he registered who had walked in. Not surprise. Guilt. Mr. Reed? Whitfield said, rising from his desk too quickly. And Mrs. Reed, I take it. Congratulations. What brings you all the way into town? Cattle counts, Thomas said, setting the ledger down on the desk without preamble. Specifically, the 8 head that went missing from our last 4 sales, according to your own recorded figures against mine. Whitfield's smile didn't waver, but his hand resting on the desk went very still. Discrepancies happen, Mr. Reed. Counting cattle isn't an exact science. 6 discrepancies, 4 sales always in your favor, never mine, Evelyn said, stepping forward. That's not bad luck, Mr. Whitfield. That's a pattern. I don't appreciate the implication, Mrs. Reed. Then perhaps you'd prefer we take this ledger directly to the territorial marshal instead of discussing it here, Evelyn said evenly. I understand cattle theft carries a rather unforgiving penalty in this county. Whitfield's composure cracked. That's not necessary, he said quickly. I'm sure we can settle this between ourselves. We could, Thomas said. Or you could explain to us why a courthouse fire 3 years ago happened to destroy the one deed proving my father's legal ownership of 640 acres and nothing else in your filing cabinet. The color drained from Whitfield's face. I don't know anything about that fire. I think you do, Evelyn said quietly. I think you've known for quite some time, and I think you've been paid very well to keep knowing it silently. The only question left, Mr. Whitfield, is whether you'd rather keep that silence and face a marshal over stolen cattle or break it and help us instead." For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Whitfield sat down heavily in his chair, all the polish gone out of him at once. "If I tell you anything," he said, voice low, "Hollis will ruin me. Or worse." "And if you don't," Thomas said, "we walk out of here and hand this ledger to the marshal within the hour, and you can explain the missing cattle to him instead." Whitfield's hands were shaking. "There was a second deed," he said finally. "A duplicate filed the same year as the original, kept separately in the Territorial Archive in Denver, as a safeguard back when the county was still new enough that Larkspur's records weren't fully trusted. Most people don't know it exists. I only know because I processed the original filing paperwork years before Hollis ever paid me a dime." Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. "A second deed," she repeated. "Still in Denver." "If it hasn't been destroyed too," Whitfield said. "I can't promise you that. I only know it existed. I never told Hollis, because as long as I kept that piece of knowledge to myself, I figured I had something worth more to him alive than dead." "You're a coward," Thomas said, but there was no real heat in it, only exhaustion and something close to relief. "I am," Whitfield agreed miserably, "but I'm a coward who just told you where to look." They rode back to the ranch in silence. For the first mile, the weight of the discovery too large for any of them to speak around it immediately. "Denver," Thomas finally said. "Charles Ambrose is already there. If the second deed exists, he can find it faster than any of us could." "We need to get word to him tonight," Evelyn said. "And we need Josiah Pratt's testimony filed alongside it, so that even if the deed is gone, we still have a living witness to the original sale." "Two paths to the same truth," Thomas said. "Hollis can't burn down every piece of evidence in the territory." "He's already tried once," Amos said grimly from his horse a few paces behind them. "Don't put it past him to try again." The words had barely left his mouth when Thomas suddenly pulled his horse to a hard stop. Evelyn followed his gaze toward the ranch house still a half-mile distant, smoke curling faintly against the darkening sky. Too much smoke. Too dark, too thick to be the ordinary chimney fire they'd left banked that morning. "Thomas." "Go," he said, already spurring his horse forward. "Now." They rode the last half-mile at a dead gallop. Evelyn's heart in her throat, praying with every stride that it was nothing, a grass fire, a chimney gone wrong. Anything but what the sick certainty in her stomach was already telling her it was. They crested the final rise and Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. The barn was burning. Flames climbed the old timber walls in furious orange sheets, smoke rolling black against the darkening sky, and standing at the edge of the firelight, watching it burn with his arms crossed, and no urgency in his posture at all, was Silas Cobb. He didn't run. He didn't even flinch when Thomas's horse thundered toward him. He simply smiled, tipped his hat, and said, loud enough to carry over the roar of the flames, "Consider that a friendly reminder, Reed. Mr. Hollis wanted you to know he's not waiting 9 days anymore." Thomas was off his horse before it fully stopped sprinting toward the well with a bucket he'd grabbed off the fence post, and Evelyn was moving right behind him, screaming for Amos to open the corral gate before the terrified horses trapped inside the burning barn hurt themselves trying to escape. "The horses first," she shouted. "The barn can be rebuilt. Get the horses out." Amos was already there, yanking the gate wide, and 3 horses bolted past him into the dark mains, wild eyes rolling white with panic. Silas Cobb didn't run. He sat his horse at the edge of the firelight for one more long second, watching the chaos he'd caused with something close to satisfaction, and then he turned and rode off unhurried into the dark like a man who had all the time in the world and knew it. "Let him go!" Thomas shouted when Amos reached for his rifle. "Water now!" They fought the fire for what felt like hours, though Evelyn would later learn it had been closer to 40 minutes, passing buckets from the well, in a chain beating at the spreading flames with wet burlap sacks, until finally, mercifully, the fire guttered down into smoke and blackened timber instead of climbing higher. Half the barn was gone. The other half stood scorched and smoking, but standing. Evelyn sank down onto an overturned water trough. Her hands blistered her lungs raw with smoke, and watched Thomas stagger the last few feet toward her. Soot streaked across his face, his shirt torn at the shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he asked, dropping to his knees in front of her, taking her hands in his before she could answer, turning them over to examine the raw skin of her palms. "I'm fine," she said. "Thomas, I'm fine." "You could have been in that barn." "I wasn't. You could have been." His voice cracked on the second word, and Evelyn realized with a jolt that went straight through her chest that his hands were shaking. Not from exertion, from fear. "Silas Cobb rode onto this land and burned my barn to send me a message, and if you had been standing 10 feet closer—" "I wasn't," she said again, softer this time, and she turned her hand in his so that her blistered palm pressed against his. "I'm here. We're both here." Thomas closed his eyes. For a moment, he simply knelt there in the dirt and the smoke holding her hand, like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just tried very hard to take something from him. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he said quietly. "The moment I asked you to stay, I put you in danger. I have no right to ask anyone to share. You didn't ask me to stay in danger, Thomas. Garrett Hollis put me in danger the moment he decided a woman on this land was inconvenient to his plans. That is not your doing. That is his." "It doesn't feel that way from where I'm kneeling." "Then look at me instead of at your guilt," Evelyn said, and something in her tone made him open his eyes. "I am not Margaret. I am not going to disappear into fear just because the fight got harder tonight. If anything, Mr. Reed tonight only confirmed it. Garrett Hollis is frightened enough of us to burn down a barn. Frightened men make mistakes. We are going to find his." Amos found them still kneeling in the dirt a few minutes later, his face grim in the dying firelight. "Lost about half the hay stores," he reported. "Horses are shaken, but unhurt near as I can tell. Could have been a lot worse." "It was meant to be a warning," Thomas said, rising, pulling Evelyn up with him. "Not a killing blow. Hollis wants us frightened, not dead. Not yet." "Small comfort," Amos muttered. "It's the only comfort we've got tonight," Thomas said. "Get some sleep if you can. We ride at first light." "Ride where?" Evelyn asked. Thomas turned to her, and something had hardened in his expression since the fire. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resolve that hadn't been there before. "Denver," he said. "We're not waiting 9 days for the survey and hoping Pratt's letter arrives safely on its own. Cobb just told us Hollis isn't waiting either, so neither are we." Yes. They left before dawn, the three of them. The ledger and Josiah Pratt's letter both sealed carefully into Thomas's coat, Amos riding a half-mile ahead as a lookout watching the road for any sign of Cobb doubling back. Evelyn had never ridden this hard in her life. Her legs ached by mid-morning, her back by noon, but she said nothing, matching Thomas's pace mile for mile, refusing to be the reason they slowed. "You could ride in the wagon," Thomas said, glancing sideways at her during a brief rest to water the horses. "Nobody would think less of you for it." "I would think less of myself," Evelyn said. "The wagon is slower. We don't have time for slower." Thomas studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Margaret never would have said that," he said quietly. "I'm not Margaret." "No," Thomas agreed. "You're not." He didn't say it like a comparison meant to wound. He said it like a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about what a wife on this land could be. They reached the stage road junction outside Larkspur by early afternoon, the same route Josiah Pratt's coach was scheduled to travel 2 days from now on his journey south from Cheyenne. And it was there that Thomas's plan nearly fell apart before it began. "There," Amos said, reining his horse in, sharply pointing toward a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile off the road. "Riders. 3 of them. Been sitting there a good while by the look of their horses." Thomas's face went tight. "Hollis's men," he said, "waiting for the stage." "They don't know which day Pratt's actually traveling," Evelyn said quickly. Do they? We never told anyone the exact date. They don't need the exact date, Thomas said grimly. They only need to watch every stage that comes through this junction until the right one arrives. Hollis has money enough to keep men waiting a week if he has to. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Then we have to get to Pratt before he ever reaches this road, she said. We have to intercept him ourselves further north before he gets anywhere near this junction. That means splitting up, Thomas said. Someone rides north to meet Pratt's stage early and redirect him off the main road. Someone else has to keep watching this junction in case I'm wrong, and Hollis's men already know more than we think they do. I'll go north, Evelyn said immediately. Absolutely not. Thomas, you've never traveled that road. You don't know the territory. If something goes wrong, then teach me right now in the next 5 minutes, because Amos knows this land better than either of us and needs to stay here watching those riders, and you are the only one who can meet with Charles Ambrose in Denver in time to have him ready for a filing before the survey. Evelyn's voice was steady, urgent, unwilling to bend. There is no version of this plan where all three of us do everything ourselves, Thomas. We have to trust each other with pieces of it. Thomas looked at her, and Evelyn watched the exact moment he understood she was right, and hated it. If anything happens to you, nothing is going to happen to me. I am going to ride north, find an old man on a stagecoach and politely inform him that his life is in danger and his testimony is needed elsewhere. That is all. That is not all, and you know it. Thomas. She reached out and gripped his forearm hard enough that he stilled. I told you at the ranch I would rather be calm and useful than frightened and idle. Let me be useful. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and pressed a small revolver into her hand, closing her fingers around the grip with his own. Do you know how to use this? My father taught me before he got sick. I haven't practiced in years. Then let's hope you don't need to remember. His voice had gone rough. Ride hard. Stay off the main road where you can. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you turn around and you come back to this junction. Don't be brave, Evelyn. Be careful. I can survive losing this land. I don't think I can survive losing you. Evelyn's breath caught. It was the closest thing to a declaration either of them had spoken aloud since the train platform, and there was no time to examine it, no time to ask what it meant, because Amos was already waving urgently from the tree line, and the riders under the cottonwoods were beginning to move. Go, Thomas said. Now. The ride north was the longest 3 hours of Evelyn's life. She kept the revolver tucked against her hip, kept her horse to a hard, punishing pace, kept her eyes moving across every ridge and tree line for a sign of riders that never quite materialized. Though twice, she thought she heard hoofbeats behind her, and twice, she was wrong. Her own heartbeat playing tricks on her over the wind. She found the stage road exactly where Thomas had described it, a narrow rutted track cutting through open grassland, and she positioned herself at a bend where any coach traveling south would have to slow to navigate the turn. She waited. An hour passed, then another. By the time she finally heard the distant rattle of wheels and the jangle of a harness, her hands had gone numb from gripping the reins too tightly, and her nerves had stretched thin enough that she nearly called out too early before she was certain it was the right coach. "Mr. Pratt!" she shouted, riding out to meet it as the driver reined in startled. "Josiah Pratt, is he aboard?" A weathered face appeared at the coach window, cautious alert. "Who's asking?" "Evelyn Reed. My husband is Thomas Reed. You wrote to him about a sale you witnessed in 1861. The man's expression shifted recognition, then something sharper. "Mrs. Reed, I wasn't expecting to be met on the road." "There are men waiting at the Larkspur Junction," Evelyn said quickly, "working for Garrett Hollis. We believe they're watching every stage that comes through waiting for you. I need you to come with me off this road before you reach them." Pratt's face went pale. "How far to the junction?" "An hour, maybe less at this pace." "Then we haven't much time to argue about it, have we?" The old man was already reaching for his traveling case. "Driver, I'll be departing here. Continue on without me, and if anyone asks, You never saw me get off." The driver, to his credit, asked no questions, simply nodded and touched his hat, and within minutes the coach was rattling away south, empty of its most important passenger, while Evelyn led Josiah Pratt on foot toward a stand of trees where she'd left a spare horse tied and waiting exactly as Thomas had instructed. "You're younger than I expected," Pratt said, eyeing her as she helped him mount. "Reed's letters made you sound like a formidable woman. I confess I pictured someone twice your age." "I've had to become formidable rather quickly," Evelyn said. "Can you ride, Mr. Pratt? We have a fair distance to cover before dark." "I can ride," he said. "I'll manage. Though I'll admit, Mrs. Reed, I did not expect my testimony about a land sale 20 years past to involve being smuggled off a stagecoach by a rancher's wife with a revolver on her hip." "Neither did I, Mr. Pratt," Evelyn said, swinging back onto her own horse. "But here we are." They took a longer route back, deliberately avoiding the junction where Hollis's men still waited, adding nearly 2 hours to the journey, and by the time they reached the small way station where Thomas had arranged to meet them, the sky had gone deep orange with the last light of evening. Thomas was waiting outside, and the moment he saw them crest the rise, something in his entire posture collapsed with relief. He was at Evelyn's horse before she'd even fully dismounted, his hands closing around her arms, checking her over with the same desperate thoroughness he had the night of the fire. "You're all right," he said. "You're all right. I told you I would be. You told me a great many things today, and I believed approximately none of them until this exact moment." His voice was rough, and for just a second before he seemed to remember they weren't alone. Something in his face looked like a man who had spent the last 5 hours imagining every possible way the day could have ended badly. Josiah Pratt cleared his throat pointedly from atop his horse. "If the reunion is concluded," he said not unkindly, "I would very much like to discuss the matter of the deed before Garrett Hollis's men discover I'm not where they expect me to be." They rode through the night to reach a small inn outside Denver, one Thomas trusted, run by a widow named Constance, who had known his father and owed the Reed family a debt of gratitude old enough that Thomas was certain her loyalty could not be bought. Charles Ambrose met them there the following morning. A tall, precise man in a well-tailored coat, exactly the kind of lawyer Evelyn had imagined from Thomas's description, sharp-eyed and immediately businesslike. "Mr. Pratt." Ambrose shook the old notary's hand firmly. "Your testimony, should it hold up, may be the single most important document in this dispute. I need every detail you remember about that sale precisely as you remember it, and I need it in writing, witnessed and notarized properly this time, before Hollis's people have any opportunity to interfere." "I remember it well enough," Pratt said. "A man doesn't forget witnessing an honest transaction between two neighbors, especially when one of those neighbors' sons turns up 20 years later, fighting to keep what was rightfully purchased." For the next 3 hours, Evelyn watched Pratt recount every detail of that summer day in 1861. The exact wording of the sale, the price paid, the handshake between Thomas's father and Everett Hollis that had sealed the agreement long before any lawyer's signature made it official. Ambrose wrote furiously, occasionally stopping to press for clarification, building what Evelyn slowly realized was becoming an ironclad account. "This is good," Ambrose said finally, setting down his pen. "This is very good. Combined with your father's personal ledger, Thomas, this gives us a witnessed account strong enough to challenge the missing county record directly. But it would be considerably stronger if we could also locate that second deed Whitfield mentioned, the duplicate filed in the Territorial Archive." "I sent word to the archive clerk 2 days ago," Thomas said, "asking him to search the records under a different name so as not to draw attention to what we're looking for." "And?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "No response yet." "Then we go to the archive ourselves," Evelyn said. "Today. We don't wait for a letter that might never come." The Territorial Archive was a squat brick building near the center of Denver, and the clerk who greeted them, a nervous young man named Peterson, went visibly pale the moment Thomas introduced himself. "Reed," he said. I received your letter, sir, but I—" "But you what?" Thomas asked, and something in his voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Someone else came asking about the same records," Peterson said, his hands twisting together. "2 days ago, a man, Well-dressed, said he was conducting research for a client. He asked specifically about land filings from the Larkspur district from the 1860s. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Did he find anything? Thomas asked. I don't know, Peterson admitted. I wasn't the one who assisted him, but when I went to locate the file you'd requested this morning after your letter arrived, it was gone. Ambrose finished grimly. Peterson nodded miserably. The entire box for that district and year, missing from the archive shelf. I've searched everywhere. I don't understand how it could simply vanish. It didn't vanish, Thomas said, his voice flat with fury. It was stolen, by the same man who burned my courthouse records 3 years ago, or someone working for him. Evelyn felt something cold and furious settle in her chest. Then he's ahead of us, she said. Hollis knew about the second deed before we did. He's been one step ahead this entire time. Not entirely ahead, Ambrose said slowly. Mr. Peterson, is there any record of who requested that file? Any log of visitors to this archive? Peterson's face brightened slightly. There's a visitor register. Everyone who requests archive documents signs it by law. Then find that page, Ambrose said, and let us see exactly whose name is written on it. The name in the register, written in a careful, deliberate hand, was not Garrett Hollis's. It was a name none of them recognized at all, a Mr. Elias Vance, listed as a private investigator representing an unnamed client. A hired man, Thomas said, staring at the signature. Of course, Hollis wouldn't dirty his own hands walking into an archive. This Vance, Evelyn said slowly, an idea forming. If he's a private investigator, he might be findable. Denver isn't a large enough city to hide a man like that completely. Ambrose was already nodding. I know several men in this city who make it their business to know every investigator working for hire. Give me a day, perhaps 2. We don't have 2 days, Thomas said. The survey is in 6. Then I will move as quickly as humanly possible, Ambrose said. In the meantime, I want Mr. Pratt's testimony filed formally with the territorial court this afternoon under seal, so that regardless of what happens next, there is now an official record of a witnessed account contradicting Hollis's claim. Whatever else occurs, they cannot make that disappear the way they made the courthouse copy disappear. It was, Evelyn thought, the first genuinely secure thing that had happened since they'd left the ranch 3 days ago. It did not feel like enough. That evening in the small room Constance had given them at the inn, Evelyn sat by the window while Thomas paced, going over Ambrose's notes again and again, as though sheer repetition might reveal some detail they'd missed. You should rest, she said finally. You haven't slept properly in 3 days. Neither have you. No, she admitted. But someone has to be sensible, and it appears to be my turn. Thomas stopped pacing. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his exhausted expression softened into something else entirely. Can I ask you something? He said. Something that has nothing to do with deeds, or Hollis, or any of it. You can ask me anything, Thomas. He crossed the room slowly and sat down across from her, close enough that she could see every line of worry etched into his face. Are you happy? He asked. Not safe, not useful, not brave. Though God knows you've been all 3 these past 3 days in ways I still can't quite believe. I'm asking if you're happy, here, with me, with all of this you never asked for. Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the question, surprised more by how much she wanted to answer it honestly. I don't know if happy is the right word yet, she said slowly. I know that 3 months ago I was invisible. A debt to be settled. A problem to be married off. And these past 3 days riding into danger beside a man who trusts me enough to hand me a revolver and send me alone to intercept a witness. She paused, searching for the words. I have never once felt invisible with you, Thomas. Frightened, yes. Exhausted, certainly. But never invisible. I think that might be the beginning of happiness, even if it doesn't look anything like what I imagined. Something moved across Thomas's face. Raw, unguarded, the same expression she'd glimpsed for half a second on the train platform before he'd covered it with distance. I asked Margaret that question exactly once, he said quietly. Near the end, she said she didn't know either. I told myself at the time that not knowing was better than a definite no. His voice roughened. I understand now that not knowing was its own kind of answer. I just didn't want to hear it. I'm not giving you that answer, Thomas. I know, he said. That's what terrifies me most. He reached out slowly and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his hand lingering against her cheek, with a gentleness that startled her. I don't know how to do this without being afraid of losing it, he admitted. But I would rather be afraid and honest than safe and silent. So thank you. For today. For riding north alone. For not disappearing when everything in this fight would have given you every reason to. Evelyn's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment entirely, and Ambrose's urgent voice came through the wood. Thomas? Evelyn, you need to come now. I found Elias Vance. They found the lawyer downstairs in Constance's small parlor, pacing with an energy that hadn't been there hours earlier. He's staying at a boarding house on the east side of the city, Ambrose said without preamble. A contact of mine confirmed it an hour ago. But that's not the concerning part. What's the concerning part? Thomas asked. My contact also confirmed who's paying him. It isn't Garrett Hollis directly. It's a firm out of Denver, Sterling and Cross, retained according to public filing by a consortium of investors with interests in territorial mineral rights. Ambrose's expression was grim. Hollis isn't fighting you alone anymore, Thomas. He's sold a stake in this land, or promised one to investors with far deeper pockets than a single rancher's grudge. This isn't just about your father's will anymore. This is about gold money moving through Denver, and men who will not care in the slightest whether the story behind that land is honest or stolen, so long as the paperwork eventually says it belongs to them. The room went very still. That changes everything, Thomas said quietly. It changes the stakes, Ambrose agreed. Not the strategy. We still need that second deed or Vance's stolen file or a confession we can use in court. But Thomas, I need you to understand. If there is real money behind Hollis now, the barn fire may not be the worst thing his people are willing to do. Evelyn felt Thomas's hand find hers in the tense silence that followed, gripping tightly, and she understood without either of them saying it aloud that whatever came next would be far more dangerous than anything they had already survived. Then we go to this boarding house, Evelyn said, and we find out exactly what Elias Vance took from that archive before Sterling and Cross or Garrett Hollis or anyone else has the chance to bury it for good. The boarding house Vance called home sat at the end of a narrow street lined with identical clapboard fronts, unremarkable enough that Evelyn understood immediately why a man wanting to disappear into Denver would choose it. Thomas knocked twice before a landlady answered, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, eyeing the three of them with open suspicion. Mr. Vance in? Thomas asked. Who's asking? Business associates, Ambrose said smoothly, stepping forward before Thomas's obvious tension could sour the exchange. Regarding a research matter, we won't take much of his time. The landlady studied them a moment longer, then jerked her head toward the stairs. Second door on the left, though I'll tell you he's been jumpy as a cat all week. Barely eats. Keeps the curtains drawn. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Thomas. A man who kept his curtains drawn was a man afraid of being seen. They climbed the narrow staircase together, and Thomas knocked 3 careful raps. Mr. Vance, my name is Thomas Reed. I believe you've been looking into records concerning my family's land. Silence. Then, after a long moment, the sound of a bolt sliding back and the door opened just enough to reveal a thin, unshaven man with hollow eyes and a revolver held low against his leg. Reed, Vance said, his voice tight. I wondered if you'd find me eventually. May we come in? Vance hesitated, glanced past them down the empty hallway, then stepped back to let them enter, bolting the door again immediately behind them. The room was small, sparse, and in disarray, a half-packed traveling case sitting open on the bed, papers scattered across a narrow desk, a bottle of whiskey standing 3/4 empty beside an untouched plate of food. You're leaving, Evelyn said. I'm trying to, Vance said. Every time I get close I lose my nerve. A man in my line of work develops instincts, Mrs. Reed. Mine have been screaming at me for a week. Then let's make this quick, Thomas said. You went to the Territorial Archive 4 days ago. You requested the Larkspur land filings from 1861. The next morning, that file was missing from the shelf. Vance's jaw tightened. I didn't take it to destroy it, he said. I want that understood, whatever you think of me. I took it because my clients wanted to know what it said before deciding how to proceed. That was my instruction. Retrieve review report. I never intended to keep it permanently. Where is it now? Ambrose asked sharply. Vance let out a short, humorless laugh and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. That, he said, is precisely the problem. Explain, Thomas said. I read the file the night I took it, Vance said. There was a second deed in there exactly as you probably suspect, filed separately from the county records dated the same year as the original sale naming your father as sole legal owner of 640 acres witnessed and notarized by a Josiah Pratt of Larkspur County. Evelyn's heart leapt. Then it exists, she breathed. It's real. It was real, Vance said grimly. For about 6 hours. I sent word to my employer that same night describing exactly what I'd found. I expected instructions to deliver it. Instead, he rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted. Instead, 2 men I've never seen before showed up at this boarding house at 4 a.m, took the file directly out of my traveling case while I slept and left without a word. Hollis's men, Thomas said flatly. I don't think so, Vance said, and something in his tone made the room go still. Hollis wanted that deed found Mr. Reed. He wanted it in his hand so he could burn it same as he burned the original. These men didn't work for him. I recognized one of them from a previous job. He does work for Sterling and Cross directly. Not for Hollis, for the investors backing him. The silence stretched taut. They're cutting Hollis out, Ambrose said slowly, understanding dawning across his face. If Sterling and Cross has the only surviving proof of legal ownership and Hollis doesn't know it exists, then they hold the leverage over both of you, Evelyn finished. Over Thomas because he can't disprove Hollis's claim without that deed, and over Hollis because the moment he wins this land through fraud, they can produce a legitimate deed and take it right back out from under him on far more profitable terms than whatever percentage he originally promised them. Vance nodded grimly. That's my read on it too. I don't know what their endgame is exactly. I only know I was paid to retrieve a piece of paper, and instead, I stumbled into something considerably larger than a rancher's land dispute. Larger and considerably more dangerous than I was told to expect. Why are you telling us any of this? Thomas asked. You could have simply disappeared and left us chasing a document that no longer exists in any form we can use. Vance's laugh was bitter and humorless. Because I have a conscience, Mr. Reed, buried under several years of poor decisions. And because those men who walked out of here with your deed also made it very clear that a private investigator who's already seen too much is a loose end worth tying off permanently once he's no longer useful. His hand tightened around the revolver, still resting in his lap. I would rather tell you the truth and take my chances leaving this territory than sit here waiting to become someone's unfortunate accident. Chata. Where were they taking it? Ambrose pressed. The deed. Did you hear anything? A location? An office? Anything at all? Vance closed his eyes thinking. One of them mentioned a name. Marshall. Said the deed needed to reach Marshall before the survey, so it could be presented at the right moment to the right buyer once the dust settled. Marshall, Thomas repeated. That's not a name I know. It might not be a person, Evelyn said slowly. It might be a place, or a firm. Sterling and Cross has offices in this city, doesn't it, Mr. Ambrose? It does, Ambrose said. On Larimer Street. I've had dealings with their senior partner before on unrelated matters. If this deed is moving through their offices, there may be a way to intercept it through entirely legal channels, a subpoena, if we can convince a judge there's cause. A subpoena takes time we don't have, Thomas said. The survey is in 5 days. Then we don't wait for a subpoena, Evelyn said. We go to Sterling and Cross ourselves today. and we make it very clear that we know exactly what they're holding and exactly what happens to their reputation in this territory if word gets out that a respected investment firm is complicit in stealing legal documents to manipulate a federal land survey. Vance looked at her with something like astonishment. You intend to bluff a firm of investors with more money than your entire ranch is worth. I intend to tell them the truth loudly enough that it becomes inconvenient for them to keep lying, Evelyn said. Men like that don't fear the law nearly as much as they fear a scandal that costs them future business. If Charles can draft something formal enough to sound like the opening move of a lawsuit, and we deliver it ourselves in person today, it might rattle them enough to make a mistake. Ambrose finished, already nodding slowly. It's aggressive, it's risky, but given our timeline, Mrs. Reed, I don't see a safer option that also succeeds in 5 days. Thomas looked between them, something conflicted working across his face. And if it doesn't rattle them, he asked, if we walk into their office and they simply have us removed, or worse, then we've lost nothing we hadn't already lost the moment that deed left this room, Evelyn said. But if we do nothing, Thomas, we've guaranteed it. Sterling and Cross occupied the top floor of a handsome brick building on Larimer Street, and the clerk at the front desk took one look at Charles Ambrose's card and Thomas Reed's grim expression and disappeared into a back office without a word. They were made to wait nearly 20 minutes. Evelyn suspected it was deliberate. When the inner door finally opened, the man who emerged was younger than she expected, perhaps 40, impeccably dressed, with the kind of easy-practiced smile that told Evelyn immediately he had given this exact performance to dozens of anxious visitors before them. Mr. Ambrose, a pleasure as always, and you must be Mr. Reed. He extended a hand Thomas did not take. I'm afraid I'm not certain what brings you to our offices today. A document, Thomas said, removed illegally from the Territorial Archive 4 nights ago, and I believe it currently sits somewhere within these walls. The man's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went carefully still. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Reed. It's an accurate one, Ambrose said, stepping forward, his lawyer's voice suddenly filling the room with a formal weight that made even the well-dressed partner straighten slightly. I have a signed statement from the man your firm employed to retrieve it, detailing the theft, the names of the men who collected it from him, and his understanding of your firm's intent to leverage that document against both Garrett Hollis and my client, depending on which arrangement proves most profitable once the survey concludes. The color drained slightly from the man's face. I don't know what you think I think, Ambrose continued smoothly, that a filing detailing theft of Territorial Archive property, obstruction of a federal land survey, and conspiracy to defraud, submitted to both the Territorial Court and several newspapers, I happen to be acquainted with, would prove enormously inconvenient for a firm whose entire business depends on investors trusting your discretion and integrity. I think you have perhaps one opportunity to make this problem disappear quietly, and it is standing in your office right now. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. What exactly, the man said, finally, his voice considerably less smooth than before, would make this problem disappear? The deed, Thomas said. Returned to my possession today along with a written statement confirming its authenticity and the date of its original filing. And in exchange, Ambrose said, my client agrees not to pursue legal action against your firm for its theft, and this conversation never occurred. The man studied them for a long, tense moment, calculating something behind his careful expression. I'll need to speak with my partners, he said finally. You have 1 hour, Ambrose said. After that, Mr. Reed and I walk to the Territorial Court and file the statement exactly as written. So, the hour passed in near silence, the 4 of them waiting in a small anteroom while muffled voices argued somewhere behind closed doors. Evelyn sat beside Thomas, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching him stare at the wall with an intensity that told her his mind was somewhere else entirely, back at the ranch, perhaps, or in the past, or turning over every possible way, this could still go wrong. "You're quiet," she said softly. "I'm thinking," Thomas said, "that 3 weeks ago I was a man alone on a ranch, certain I would lose everything my father built with no one to help me fight for it. And today I'm sitting in an investment firm in Denver, watching my wife threaten a room full of wealthy men into submission through sheer force of will. Is that a complaint?" "No," Thomas said, and something in his voice had gone unexpectedly rough. "It is the furthest thing from a complaint." He reached over and took her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away when the door finally opened again. The partner who returned looked considerably older than he had an hour before. "We're prepared to return the document," he said stiffly, "on the condition that this arrangement remains entirely confidential and that your firm, Mr. Ambrose, makes no further inquiry into Sterling and Cross's dealings with Mr. Hollis." "Agreed," Ambrose said, "provided the deed is authentic, complete, and delivered into Mr. Reed's hands within the next 5 minutes. It was. Evelyn watched Thomas's hands shake as he unfolded the aged document. Watched his eyes move across the careful formal script, confirming what Josiah Pratt had sworn to days earlier, that Thomas Reed's father had purchased 640 acres of Colorado land fair and legal witnessed and notarized 20 years before Garrett Hollis had ever begun trying to steal it back. "It's real," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Evelyn, it's real. It's here." "I know," she said, gripping his arm, unable to keep the tremor of relief from her own voice. "Now we make certain no one can ever take it from you again." They filed the deed with the territorial court that same afternoon alongside Pratt's sworn testimony and Ambrose's formal motion contesting Hollis's claim, and for the first time since arriving in Denver, Evelyn allowed herself to believe they might actually win. The believing lasted less than a day. They were preparing to leave the inn the following morning, bags packed, horses saddled, when a boy arrived at the door with a folded note addressed to Thomas, delivered, he said, by a well-dressed man who'd paid him a full $1 to run it over quickly. Thomas read it once, then again. His face went pale. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. He handed her the note without a word. "Mr. Reed, I understand you've been busy in Denver. Congratulations on locating what was lost. It changes less than you think. A judge has been persuaded to hear an emergency motion tomorrow morning challenging the legitimacy of your marriage as fraudulent, arranged solely to manufacture a legal defense against a claim you know to be valid. Bring your new wife if you like. I'd be curious to see how well she holds up under cross-examination about the true nature of your hurried courtship. G.H." Evelyn's blood went cold. "He knows we found the deed," she said. "And instead of fighting it directly, he's attacking the marriage itself. If a judge rules this marriage was arranged in bad faith," Ambrose said grimly, having read over her shoulder, "the protective clause in your father's will becomes meaningless. Thomas, regardless of what the deed proves, Hollis doesn't need to disprove your ownership anymore. He only needs to disprove the legitimacy of the thing protecting it. Tomorrow morning," Thomas said, "we have less than a day to prepare a defense against an accusation that is in its most basic form half true. I did marry Evelyn partly to protect this land. I told her that myself the first night she arrived. Then we don't hide that truth," Evelyn said, her mind racing. "We can't. Hollis clearly already knows it or suspects it enough to gamble on it in front of a judge. We tell the truth completely instead of letting him control what pieces of it a judge hears. Evelyn, Thomas, listen to me." She gripped both his hands, forcing him to look at her instead of at the note crumpled between them. "You married me partly for the land. I married you partly out of desperation because I had nowhere else to go and no other path to a life of my own choosing. If we stand in front of that judge and pretend this marriage began as some grand romance, Hollis's lawyers will tear that lie apart in minutes because it isn't true, and lies collapse under scrutiny far faster than difficult truths do." "Then what do we tell him?" "The truth," Evelyn said. That we married as strangers for practical reasons, exactly as half the marriages in this territory begin. That practicality is not fraud, Thomas. It's survival. And that whatever brought us together in the first place, what exists between us now, is real and growing and worth defending honestly, rather than dressing up in a lie neither of us needs. Ambrose was watching them both carefully. That, he said slowly, might actually work. Judges in this territory understand practical marriages, Thomas. Half of them married that way themselves. What they don't tolerate well is being lied to in their own courtroom. Honesty delivered with conviction may serve you better here than any performance of romance ever could. Thomas looked at Evelyn for a long moment, something raw and searching in his expression. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "What you said? That what exists between us now is real?" Evelyn's breath caught. Around them, Ambrose and Vance and the boy waiting for a reply, all seemed to fade into irrelevance for one suspended second. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true." Something in Thomas's face broke open, gentle and unguarded, in a way she had not seen since the night he'd told her about Margaret. "Then let's go tell a judge exactly that," he said, "truth and all." The courtroom the next morning was smaller than Evelyn expected, but it felt enormous once Garrett Hollis walked in. She had imagined him a dozen different ways over the past 2 weeks. A monster, a shadow, a name attached to fire and theft and threats scrawled on porch boards. The man himself was almost disappointingly ordinary. Silver-haired, well-dressed, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life doubted he would get what he wanted. He nodded to Thomas with mocking courtesy as he took his seat. "Reed," he said, "and the new Mrs. Reed. You're prettier than the rumors suggested. Shame you'll be widowed of this land soon enough, whatever happens to the marriage itself." "Careful, Mr. Hollis," Ambrose said coolly. Threats spoken in a courtroom have an unfortunate habit of ending up in the official record. Hollis's smile didn't waver. "I don't make threats, counselor. I make observations. There's a difference, though. I understand it's a subtle one." The judge entered before Thomas could respond, and the room settled into tense, formal silence. Hollis's lawyer opened first, laying out the accusation with practiced precision. A marriage conducted with unusual speed, mere weeks after Thomas Reed's legal troubles began escalating to a woman with financial desperation of her own, entered into, he argued, purely as a legal maneuver rather than a genuine union. Evelyn felt every eye in the room turn toward her as the accusation landed. "Mrs. Reed," the judge said when it came time for testimony, "the court would like to hear in your own words the circumstances of your marriage." Evelyn stood, her heart hammering, and forced her voice to remain steady. "3 months ago, Your Honor, I lost my father, my home, and any means of supporting myself through no fault of my own, beyond the law's insistence that a woman cannot manage her own affairs without a husband's name attached to them. I answered Thomas Reed's advertisement because it was the only one among dozens that did not promise me comfort I did not believe in. It promised me honesty and partnership instead." "Did Mr. Reed disclose his legal difficulties with the land before your marriage?" the judge asked. "He did," Evelyn said. "The very afternoon I arrived, before we had even reached his ranch. He told me plainly that a clause in his father's will made a legitimate marriage relevant to his claim, and that this was part, though not the entirety, of why he had placed the advertisement." A murmur moved through the small courtroom. "You're admitting, then," Hollis's lawyer said, seizing the opening, "that this marriage was by your own husband's admission, motivated at least partly by legal strategy." "I am admitting that my husband was honest with me," Evelyn said, "which is more than I can say for the men who burned his barn 9 days ago, or the men who stole legal documents from a private investigator's boarding house 4 nights after that. If honesty about difficult circumstances constitutes fraud, Your Honor, then I would ask the court to consider how many marriages in this territory entered for land, for security, for survival, rather than romance, would fail that same standard." The judge's expression remained carefully neutral, but Evelyn saw something shift in his eyes. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "do you love your wife?" The question landed like a physical blow. Thomas rose slowly, and for a long moment he simply looked at Evelyn standing there in the small, crowded courtroom, and something in his face made her chest tighten painfully. "I don't know if love is built in 3 weeks, Your Honor," he said finally, his voice steady despite the roughness underneath it. "I know that I have watched this woman ride alone into danger to protect a stranger's testimony. I know she found $400 of theft in my ledgers that I'd overlooked for a year. I know she stood in an investment firm in this city and threatened men with more money than I'll see in my lifetime and did not flinch once. I don't know if that's love yet, Your Honor, but I know it is the beginning of something I intend to spend the rest of my life protecting, and I will not let Garrett Hollis reduce it to a legal technicality because it's convenient for his claim." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes and forced them back, refusing to let this moment become a performance for anyone but the truth of it. The judge studied them both for a long moment. "I find no evidence of fraudulent intent in this marriage," he said finally. "The motion to invalidate is denied. As for the underlying land dispute," his eyes moved to the stack of documents Ambrose had submitted. "Given the newly filed deed and corroborating testimony, this court will require considerably more than assertion from Mr. Hollis's counsel before entertaining further challenge to Mr. Reed's ownership. I am scheduling a full hearing on the matter for 3 days from now, prior to the territorial survey." Hollis's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, fury flashing behind his eyes before he smoothed it away. "3 days?" he said quietly as the courtroom began to empty, his gaze fixed on Thomas with something cold and calculating. "A great deal can happen in 3 days, Reed. Ask your first wife how quickly things can go wrong when a man gets overconfident." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hollis?" Ambrose asked sharply. "It's an observation, Counselor." Hollis rose, buttoning his coat with unhurried precision. "I told you, I don't make threats." He walked out without another word, and Evelyn watched him go, a cold dread settling into her stomach that no legal victory, however hard won, could fully dissolve. "We won today," she said quietly once he was gone. "We won a battle," Thomas said, his jaw tight, his eyes still fixed on the door Hollis had disappeared through. "He just told us plainly that the war isn't over, and I don't think he intends to fight it with lawyers anymore." They rode for the ranch that same afternoon, unwilling to waste a single hour of the 3 days remaining. Before the final hearing, Amos and Josiah Pratt traveling with them, under Ambrose's insistence that both the deed and its witness required protection until the moment they were formally entered into permanent record. They were less than an hour from the ranch, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western hills, when Amos's horse suddenly shied hard, and he threw up a hand signaling a stop. "Riders," he said quietly. "Ahead. On the ridge." Evelyn's pulse spiked. 4 men sat their horses on the rise above the road, unmoving, watching, and even at this distance Evelyn recognized the posture of the man in front. Silas Cobb. "He's not hiding this time," Thomas said grimly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle secured against his saddle. "He wants us to see him." "What does he want?" Evelyn asked. As if in answer, one of the riders raised something above his head, a torch unlit, but unmistakable in its threat, and Silas Cobb's voice carried down across the still evening air. "Mr. Hollis sends his regards. Reed says the courtroom might have gone your way today, but there's still the small matter of a survey that can't happen if there's nothing left standing to survey." Thomas's face went white with fury. "He's threatening the house," Evelyn said. "Not the barn this time. The house." "Get behind me," Thomas said, already moving. "Amos." But Amos was already spurring his horse forward, drawing his rifle, and the 4 riders on the ridge, seeing the movement, wheeled their own horses and vanished over the far side of the hill in a spray of dust and thundering hooves, gone as quickly as they'd appeared. The silence that followed was worse than the threat itself. "They're not attacking us on the road," Thomas said slowly, understanding dawning with visible horror across his face. "That was never the point. That was a distraction." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. "Thomas." "They know we're an hour out," he said, already spurring his horse into a dead run. They wanted us to see them here so we'd waste time chasing shadows on this ridge, while whoever's actually meant to burn that house has a clear hour to finish the job before we ever reach it." Evelyn didn't waste breath answering. She was already riding faster than she had ever ridden in her life, faster than the punishing gallop north to intercept Pratt's coach, faster than anything, because somewhere ahead of them, past the darkening hills, everything Thomas Reed had spent his entire life protecting might already be burning to the ground. The ranch house was standing. Evelyn saw it first. The low silver-timbered shape of it rising against the last orange light of evening. Whole untouched, no smoke, no flame, and the relief that crashed through her chest nearly knocked her from the saddle. But something was wrong. The front door hung open. Amos reached it first off his horse before it had fully stopped, rifle already raised, and Thomas was right behind him, shouting for Evelyn to stay back, even as she ignored him completely and followed them both inside. The main room had been torn apart, drawers overturned. The desk in the corner splintered where someone had forced it open with something heavier than their hands. And at the end of the hallway, the door to Thomas's father's study stood wide, the iron latch broken clean off its hinges. "They didn't burn it," Thomas said, his voice low and shaking with a fury Evelyn had not heard from him before. "They searched it." "For what?" Evelyn asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Anything else that might help us," Thomas said, striding into the ruined study, surveying the scattered ledgers, the shelves swept clean onto the floor. "Copies, correspondence, anything they missed the first time, or anything new we might have brought back from Denver." Amos crouched by the broken desk, examining the splintered wood. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how little time they had to find it. This ain't Silas Cobb's kind of work. Cobb burns things. This is careful. "Vance," Evelyn said suddenly. Thomas turned. "Not Vance himself," she clarified quickly, "but the men who took the deed from his boarding house, Sterling and Cross's men. If they returned it to us under pressure, they may have decided the safest way to protect their own interests was to make certain there was nothing else in this house that could be used against them or against Hollis in 3 days' time. Then Hollis and Sterling and Cross aren't working together anymore," Thomas said slowly. "Not really. Cobb's out on the ridge trying to frighten us with fire. Someone else entirely is in here searching quietly, trying to make sure whatever happens at that hearing, they come out protected either way." "Men circling a dying animal," Amos said grimly, "each one trying to get their piece before the others do." Evelyn knelt beside the scattered ledgers, gathering them with hands that had gone unsteady, only now in the safety of finding the house still standing. "Is anything missing?" she asked. "Truly missing, not just thrown to the floor?" Thomas moved through the wreckage, slowly checking shelf after shelf, drawer after drawer, and Evelyn watched his shoulders sag with something that might have been relief. "No," he said finally. "Everything's here. Torn apart, but here. Whatever they came looking for, they didn't find it." Evelyn finished, "Because we already took it to Denver with us." Thomas let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, exhaustion and fury and relief tangled together in one rough sound. 3 days, he said. 3 days until the survey, and this house has now survived a fire and a break-in, and Garrett Hollis is still out there somewhere deciding what to try next. "Then we don't give him 3 quiet days to decide," Evelyn said, rising, brushing dust from her skirts, with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "We go on the offense, Thomas. We stop waiting for him to come to us." They didn't sleep that night either. Amos rode out at first light to fetch the sheriff, not out of any real faith the man would help, Thomas admitted, but because a formal report of the break-in filed and witnessed would matter later if Hollis's people tried to claim the search had never happened at all. Evelyn spent the early hours restoring order to the study, and it was there sorting through the scattered contents of a drawer that had been wrenched entirely from the desk, that her fingers found something wedged into the broken wood beneath it, a small folded paper that had slipped from view during the search, overlooked by men moving too fast to be thorough. She unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, old, the ink faded, dated nearly 3 years back, written in a hand she didn't recognize, and addressed to Thomas's father. She read it once, then went very still, then read it again to be certain. Thomas. He looked up from the ledger he'd been reassembling. What is it? I think, Evelyn said slowly, you should see this before I say anything else. He crossed the room and took the letter from her hands, and Evelyn watched his face change as he read it. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like grief. This is from Everett Hollis, he said. Garrett's father, written to my father 3 years before he died. What does it say? Thomas's hands had gone unsteady. It's an apology, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everett Hollis writing to say he knew the original sale was legitimate all along, that he'd told Garrett the truth years before this dispute ever began, and Garrett chose to pursue the claim anyway against his own father's explicit knowledge that it had no merit. Evelyn felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. Garrett has known this entire time, she said. Every threat, every fire, every stolen document, he's known from the very beginning that his claim was built on nothing but his own father's dying regret. There's more, Thomas said, and his voice had hardened into something cold and precise. Listen to this. I have told Garrett the truth of the matter, and he does not wish to hear it. He believes the gold discovered on that land is owed to our family, regardless of the honesty of the original sale, and I fear nothing I say will change his mind. I write to you now, old friend, not to undo what cannot be undone between our sons, but so that somewhere this truth exists on paper. Should my son ever attempt what I suspect he intends to attempt. The room had gone utterly silent. He knew, Thomas said again, quieter this time, as if saying it aloud might somehow make it more real. Garrett's own father tried to warn mine that this was coming years before any of it started. This changes everything, Evelyn breathed. This isn't a contested claim anymore, Thomas. This is proof of deliberate knowing fraud. If Ambrose can get this letter authenticated and entered before the hearing, then Garrett Hollis isn't fighting a legal dispute anymore. Thomas finished. He's facing a criminal one. Whoosh. They rode for Denver again within the hour, the letter secured carefully alongside the deed, and Evelyn found herself praying with an intensity that surprised her that 3 days would be enough time for Ambrose to do whatever needed to be done with this fragile, faded piece of paper that might finally end everything. Ambrose read the letter twice in his office, his expression shifting exactly as Thomas's had, disbelief giving way to something sharp and satisfied. This is extraordinary, he said. If I can authenticate the handwriting against other known samples of Everett Hollis's correspondence, and I believe I can, this letter alone may be sufficient to end the dispute entirely, without even requiring the court to weigh Pratt's testimony against the missing county record. This is a father's written confession that his son intended fraud. Judges do not look kindly on knowing deceit, Thomas. This could be the end of it. Could be, Thomas repeated, not will be. Nothing in law is ever certain until the ruling is spoken aloud, Ambrose said. But Thomas, in 15 years of practice, I have rarely seen a piece of evidence this decisive fall into a client's hands at precisely the moment it was needed most. It didn't fall, Evelyn said quietly. Hollis's own men tore that desk apart looking for something to use against us, and in doing so, they knocked loose the one thing that was always going to destroy him. Ambrose looked at her with something like admiration. Mrs. Reed, he said, I begin to suspect Garrett Hollis has made a significant error in underestimating exactly who he decided to threaten. They had 1 day left before the hearing when Josiah Pratt fell ill. It happened without warning, a fever that came on hard and fast during the night at Constance's inn, leaving the old notary pale and shaking, barely able to sit upright by morning. He can't testify like this, Constance said grimly, pressing a cool cloth to Pratt's forehead. He can barely speak, let alone stand in front of a judge and account for events 20 years past. Evelyn felt panic claw up her throat. We have his written testimony, she said, filed already under seal from Ambrose's office. Written testimony can be argued against. Ambrose said, his own composure fraying slightly for the first time since Evelyn had met him. A living witness cross-examined in person carries considerably more weight than a document alone, especially against a claim as aggressive as Hollis's lawyers are certain to mount tomorrow. Thomas paced the small room, his jaw tight. "Then we bring the letter instead," he said. "The Hollis letter. It doesn't need Pratt Healthy to speak for itself." "It's stronger with Pratt," Ambrose said. "Together they're nearly unassailable. Alone, either one carries risk." Evelyn knelt beside Pratt's bed, taking his hand, feeling how thin and fevered it was against her palm. "Mr. Pratt," she said gently, "can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Mrs. Reed, do you understand what tomorrow requires?" "I do," he rasped. "I only fear my body may not agree with my intentions." "Rest," Evelyn said. "Tonight rest completely, and tomorrow we'll see what strength the morning brings. If you cannot stand in that courtroom, we will find another way. But I would rather you arrive at that hearing alive and resting than force yourself there tonight and collapse before you ever speak a word." Pratt's hand tightened weakly around hers. "You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Reed," he murmured, already drifting back toward sleep. "Reed is a fortunate man." Evelyn glanced up and found Thomas watching her from across the room, something unguarded and tender in his exhausted expression. "He is," Thomas said quietly, "more fortunate than he deserves most days." Pratt was still weak the next morning, but conscious color returning slightly to his face, and when Ambrose gently asked whether he felt strong enough to testify, the old man nodded with more determination than his fragile body seemed to possess. "I did not travel this far," he said, "to let a fever finish what Garrett Hollis's men could not." The courthouse was more crowded this time. Word of the dispute had apparently spread through Denver's business circles, and Evelyn noticed several well-dressed men she didn't recognize, seated in the gallery, watching with sharp calculating interest. Sterling and Cross's representatives, she suspected. Here to see which way the wind would finally blow. Hollis arrived last, moving with the same unhurried confidence as before, though Evelyn thought she detected something tighter around his eyes this time, something that hadn't been there in the previous hearing. "He knows," she thought. "He knows we found something. He just doesn't know what." The judge called the proceedings to order, and Ambrose rose first, laying the newly discovered deed before the court, walking through Pratt's written testimony, with methodical precision, building the foundation of their case, exactly as he had before. Then when the moment came, he withdrew the letter. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to enter into evidence a letter dated 3 years prior to this dispute written by Everett Hollis to the elder Mr. Reed, which I believe speaks directly to the question of knowing fraud." Hollis's lawyer was on his feet immediately. "Objection. Your Honor, this document has not been previously disclosed." "It was discovered 4 days ago," Ambrose said calmly, "during a break-in at my client's home, conducted, we believe, by parties seeking to prevent exactly this discovery. I have submitted it to the court's handwriting expert for authentication against 3 separate known samples of Everett Hollis's correspondence, all of which the expert confirms as consistent." The judge accepted the document, and as he began to read, Evelyn watched Garrett Hollis's face for the first time truly lose its composure. He went pale, then rigid. Then, as the judge continued reading in silence, something close to panic flickered behind his eyes. "Your Honor," Hollis's lawyer began again, but the judge raised a hand for silence, finishing the letter before looking up. "Mr. Hollis," the judge said, his voice carrying a new, colder weight, "is this your father's handwriting?" Hollis said nothing. "Mr. Hollis," the judge repeated, sharper now, "I asked you a direct question." "It's his handwriting," Hollis said finally, his voice tight with something dangerously close to desperation. "But a letter is not proof of anything. My father was old. His memory in his final years was—" "Your father's memory," Ambrose interrupted, clearly served him well enough to write 3 pages of coherent, detailed recollection about a land sale he witnessed personally, including specific figures, dates, and the precise circumstances under which you were informed. The claim had no merit. Are you now arguing? Your own father was too infirm to know the truth of his own business dealings, Mr. Hollis. or simply too infirm to be believed the moment his testimony becomes inconvenient to you. Hollis's jaw clenched so tightly, Evelyn could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "This is a fabrication," he said. "Reed forged this to save his land." "Then perhaps," the judge said, "we should ask Mr. Pratt, who witnessed the original sale in 1861, whether the account described in this letter matches his own recollection of that day." Josiah Pratt rose slowly, leaning heavily on the arm Ambrose offered, and made his way to the front of the courtroom. "Mr. Pratt," the judge said, "does the account in this letter match your own memory of the sale you witnessed?" "Precisely," Pratt said, his weakened voice somehow carrying clear and firm through the silent room. "Down to the price paid, and the handshake that sealed it. I have carried the memory of that day for 20 years. Your Honor, because it was an honest transaction between two honorable men, and I never once imagined I would be called upon so many years later to defend it against the son of one of them." The courtroom had gone utterly still. Evelyn watched Hollis's composure crack entirely, watched the calculating confidence that had carried him through every threat and every fire finally crumble in the face of his own dead father's written conscience. "Your Honor," he tried again, desperation bleeding into his voice now. "Even if the original sale was legitimate, the destruction of county records due to the courthouse fire creates a legal question of—" "A courthouse fire," the judge interrupted coldly, "which this court has now heard testimony strongly suggesting was not accidental, and which coincides suspiciously with the timeline of your own inheritance of this dispute. Mr. Hollis, I have heard nothing today that convinces me your claim to this land holds any legitimate foundation whatsoever, and considerable evidence suggesting a deliberate, sustained pattern of fraud, intimidation, and destruction of legal property." Hollis said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. "This court finds in favor of Thomas Reed," the judge announced, confirming full and undisputed ownership of the 640 acres in question. "Furthermore, given the severity of the evidence presented regarding arson, theft of archived records, and witness intimidation, I am referring this matter to the Territorial Marshal for criminal investigation, effective immediately." The gallery erupted into murmurs, and Evelyn felt Thomas's hand find hers, gripping tight enough to hurt both of them, frozen in the disbelieving silence of a fight, finally truly won. Garrett Hollis did not go quietly. He rose from his seat, his careful composure entirely gone, now replaced by something raw and furious. "This isn't finished, Reed," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom, despite the marshal already moving toward him. "You think a piece of paper and a dying old man's memory ends this. I built half of Larkspur County's business dealings with money you'll never understand the reach of. This isn't over." "It is for you, Mr. Hollis," the judge said flatly. "Marshal, please escort Mr. Hollis and his counsel from this courtroom and see that formal charges are prepared regarding the incidents described in today's testimony." Hollis's eyes found Thomas across the room, burning with a hatred that made Evelyn instinctively step closer to her husband's side. "Enjoy your land, Reed," Hollis said, as the marshal took his arm. "I hope it was worth everything it cost you." "It was," Thomas said quietly, "worth considerably more than you ever understood, because you spent your entire life measuring worth in gold instead of in the people who stood beside you fighting for what mattered. I'm sorry for your father, Mr. Hollis. He tried to teach you the difference before he died. I hope wherever you're headed next you finally learn it." Hollis said nothing more. He was led from the courtroom in silence, and something in the room exhaled all at once, tension breaking, like a held breath finally released. Outside the courthouse, Ambrose shook Thomas's hand with genuine warmth for the first time since they'd met. "It's over," he said. "Truly over, Thomas. The land is yours permanently, unquestionably, and Garrett Hollis will spend the coming months answering for a great deal more than a failed land claim." "I don't know how to thank you," Thomas said. "Thank your wife," Ambrose said, glancing at Evelyn with a smile. "I've argued a great many cases in this territory, Thomas, but I have rarely seen a client's spouse contribute as decisively to a legal victory as Mrs. Reed did to this one." The cattle theft discovery. The confrontation with Sterling and Cross. Finding that letter buried in broken furniture, most men would have simply thrown away in frustration. I suspect you'd still be fighting this battle alone and losing it, if you'd married someone content to wait quietly at home for news. Thomas turned to Evelyn, something overwhelming and unguarded moving across his face. "He's right," he said. "About all of it." "You would have found a way," Evelyn said softly. "Maybe," Thomas said, "but I don't think I would have found it whole. I think I would have won this land and lost something in myself along the way, the same careful, guarded way I lost Margaret piece by piece without ever noticing, until it was too late." He took both her hands in his. "You didn't just help me save this ranch, Evelyn. You reminded me what it was supposed to be saved for in the first place." They rode home to Red Willow 3 days later, the deed secured permanently in the county's restored records. Josiah Pratt recovering steadily under Constance's care before beginning his own journey back toward Cheyenne, with Thomas's deepest gratitude and a modest sum of money neither Thomas nor Evelyn would ever consider Pratt's testimony to have been worth. The ranch looked different somehow when they finally crested the last rise and saw it rising against the horizon. Not because anything about the land itself had changed, because Evelyn looked at it now, and for the first time since stepping off that train 3 weeks ago, felt something unmistakable settle in her chest. Not obligation, not survival. Something that felt unmistakably like coming home. "Amos will be relieved to see us," Thomas said, watching her study the house. "I imagine so," Evelyn said. "Though I suspect he'll be more relieved to hear the news than to see our faces. Both probably." Thomas glanced at her sideways. "You're smiling." "Am I?" "You are. I don't believe I've seen you smile like that since before the train station." Evelyn considered that surprised to find it true. "I think," she said slowly, "for the first time since I arrived, I'm not bracing for the next disaster. I think for the first time, I actually believe we've won." Thomas reached over and took her hand the reins loose in his other palm, both horses slowing to an unhurried walk as the ranch house drew closer. "We have," he said. "Whatever comes next, Evelyn, it comes as something we choose, not something we're forced into by fire or fraud, or a stranger's desperate advertisement in a newspaper." "Is that a proposal of some kind, Mr. Reed?" "I believe I already married you, Mrs. Reed. You married a stranger by your own admission, partly for legal convenience," Evelyn said, though her voice had gone soft and warm, teasing in a way it had never quite managed before. "I would like at some point an actual proposal. One made for reasons that have nothing to do with wills or deeds or courtroom hearings." Thomas pulled his horse to a stop. Evelyn stopped beside him, startled by the sudden stillness. "Evelyn Harper Reed," he said, and something in his voice had gone entirely unguarded, stripped of every careful wall he'd built around himself since the day she'd stepped off that train. "I did not know 3 weeks ago that the woman who answered my advertisement would ride alone into danger to save a stranger's testimony. I did not know she would find theft hidden in my own ledgers that I'd overlooked for a year, or stand in a room full of wealthy men and refuse to be intimidated, or dig through the wreckage of a break-in and find the one piece of evidence that would finally end a fight I thought I might lose everything to. I did not know when I asked you that terrible question on the train platform that I was asking it of the one person strong enough and honest enough to answer it truthfully every single day since." Evelyn felt tears rise unbidden and did nothing to stop them. "I love you," Thomas said simply. "Not because of the land or the deed or anything this land can offer either of us. I love you because you refused to disappear. Evelyn, when disappearing would have been so much easier. I love you because you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves that kind of courage standing beside him. Will you stay? Not because of an advertisement or a will or a legal clause. Will you stay because it's what you choose freely, with nothing left to prove and no danger left forcing your hand?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, Thomas. I choose this. I choose you." He crossed the small distance between their horses and kissed her, then gentle and certain, the kind of kiss that carried 3 weeks of danger and honesty and slowly building trust behind it. And Evelyn understood in that moment that everything she had lost in Missouri had led her improbably, impossibly, to something far more valuable than anything a bookstore or a comfortable life could have offered her. She had lost a home. She had found a life. Red Willow welcomed them back with the particular curiosity of a small town that had clearly heard every rumor twice over before the truth ever arrived to correct it. By the time autumn settled over the ranch, the story had changed considerably. From the whispers that first greeted Evelyn's arrival, no longer the tale of a desperate mail-order bride marrying a stranger out of necessity, but something the townsfolk told with genuine warmth whenever her name came up at the mercantile or the church social. They called her Mrs. Reed now, and meant something entirely different by it than they had 3 months before. The woman who found the fraud in the ledgers. The woman who rode alone to save an old man's testimony. The woman who stood beside Thomas Reed, not behind him, through a fight that had nearly cost them everything, and left them instead with more than either of them had imagined possible, when a single desperate advertisement had first brought two strangers together. Evelyn still thought sometimes of that first question on the train platform. Did you come here because you wanted a new life, or because you had nowhere else to go? She understood now that the answer had never mattered as much as Thomas believed it did that first day. What mattered was not why she had come. What mattered was what she had chosen to build once she arrived. Josiah Pratt sent a letter that winter, informing them that Garrett Hollis's trial had concluded arson and fraud charges, resulting in a sentence that would keep him from ever threatening another family's land again. Elias Vance had testified against him in exchange for his own immunity, and Whitfield, stripped of his position at the county office, had left the territory entirely, rather than face the community he'd betrayed. Thomas read the letter aloud by the fire one evening, and when he finished, he simply set it aside and looked at Evelyn with an expression she had come to know well over the passing months, quiet, steady, entirely certain. "It's finally over," he said. "It was over the day you asked me that question at the station," Evelyn said, "whether you knew it yet or not." "How do you mean?" "Because that question wasn't really about whether I'd disappear," she said. "It was about whether you were willing to be honest enough, brave enough to risk someone seeing you completely after everything you'd already lost. You asked it because some part of you already hoped I'd answer differently than Margaret had, and I did." Thomas reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand, the fire casting warm light across a home that had nearly burned twice, survived theft and fraud, and a courtroom fight that could have ended everything, and stood now quiet and whole, exactly as it was always meant to. "I did not marry a stranger because I understood everything about her the moment she stepped off that train," he said softly. "I married her because she was honest enough to let me discover the truth alongside her, one difficult, terrifying, extraordinary day at a time." Evelyn smiled, tears bright in her eyes, and leaned into the warmth of a man who had once been a stranger, and was now unmistakably, undeniably everything she had ever needed to call home. Their story had never been about a perfect romance built in a single dramatic moment. It was about two wounded people who chose patience over fear, truth over silence, and each other over the safety of standing alone, and in choosing that again and again through fire and fraud, and every reason either of them had to run, they built something no stranger, no threat, and no lie would ever be strong enough to take from them again.